Hello AP US History. So the purpose of this video here is to introduce us to the earliest colonies, including New Spain, New France, and also it's important to just bear in mind that with New Spain and New France, a lot of what we're talking about actually started in period one. So this is just sort of a refresher from our discussions on those topics in period one. Okay, so what I would recommend here is to just pause for a moment and review what this chart is saying, because ultimately we covered this in period one as well. Okay, so essentially the push and the pull factor, the push into the Americas and the pull factor outside of Europe. And of course, it's actually worth bearing in mind that there were certainly people who just wanted to leave Europe temporarily. Okay, so New Spain, as you can see, it was a vast empire. Also, just take note at the dates of the founding of these different cities. Notice that the vast majority of them are actually before the start of period one, which was 1607. But speaking of 1607, Santa Fe, which was one of the most significant cities in the continental United States, and also a city that grew quite sizably during the heyday actually of Mexico in particular, and then ultimately Mexico was conquered by the United States in the Mexican-American War, but we'll get there. Okay. A few other things about New Spain while we're looking at this. The population of New Spain never got particularly high, and the reason why that was because a lot of the people who originally came to New Spain were coming in search of precious metals, so gold, silver, and the like. And when they realized that there really wasn't an ample supply of these things, many people ended up either going back, or less people started migrating there than compared to the earlier numbers, that is. So, as time went on, less and less people were attracted from Spain to settle in New Spain. And there are a lot of other reasons just in terms of the actual political stability of Spain, but let's not get into that. Basically, the idea is that New Spain stayed relatively small in terms of population, but we can see here that it remained very large in terms of size. And of course, it's eventually going to be a source of conflict with the English, who increasingly want to settle west. Okay. So New France, all right, we'll talk about this a little bit more. In your reading from chapter 3, you came across the words society of exclusion, and also we should consider a society of inclusion, right? So New France is a good example of a society of inclusion, meaning that their relationship with the American Indians was actually more accommodating for the most part. So that meant that the French settlers often intermarried with the Indian population. They often emphasized trade rather than conquest. The French settlers actually allied with the Huron Indians, and the Hurons were actually rivals with the Iroquois. So it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship between the French and the Indians that resided in that area. The St. Lawrence River was very significant for French trade because this was an easy access point to the Atlantic Ocean. But another thing that's important to bear in mind is that New France also extended all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River. And if you just consider how significant the Mississippi River Valley is in terms of large cities now to the United States, consider its significance to the French when water was the only really viable trading method. It was very difficult to trade by land, essentially. So also, there we go. New France, its population also remained relatively small, so like New Spain. There were a few reasons why this was. So one of them was this French system called Dubois, and basically that meant that the French settlers only remained in New France for a short period of time and the purpose really was for them to trade, and then they would return to France. So I actually don't know the literal translation of that phrase, but ultimately that's what it meant. Also, there were religious reasons that were keeping the French population low. The French crown was increasingly putting pressure on New France to remain Catholic. So that was very difficult. French Huguenots really didn't feel like they could seek safe haven in New France. And also the geographic location. Looking back, you can tell that quite a bit of the territory in New France has a very cold climate. It has long winters, so therefore a short growing season. That basically meant that it really wasn't that conducive to a large settlement, at least not in that period. It's worth noting that New France was a huge amount of land, not nearly as large as New Spain, but you get the idea. Okay. So New Netherland and New Sweden. Well, first of all, it's kind of random to know even that there was a New Sweden. The Dutch actually refused to recognize the independence of New Sweden. So New Netherland was essentially the entire Hudson River Valley. So some of upstate New York. So the Albany is located there, and also, of course, New Amsterdam, which is where New York is. Okay, also the Dutch, they had a society of inclusion in the sense that they allied themselves commercially with the Iroquois Confederacy. So therefore they were sort of a natural enemy to the French as well as the Huron enemies. They eventually are going to dispel the Swedish settlement away from the Delaware River Valley. This is Wilmington, Delaware, and Philadelphia is right here. So basically what happens then is that New Netherland, I should get a map that has all of New Netherland at its height. Basically it extended all the way down to the Delaware River Valley. So essentially all of New Jersey and some of Pennsylvania, but that's going to retreat pretty quickly. Okay. So as far as the Dutch are concerned, actually I already said quite a bit of that, forgive me, but the Dutch, even though their colony was not very large geographically, it was very wealthy. So it was a combination of very rich and fertile soil as well as an extensive trading network. In a lot of ways, it mimicked the type of economy that the Dutch had in the Netherlands and Holland. The Protestant work ethic is also very important to consider here. Of course, the Dutch were mainly Calvinist, and we already discussed the Protestant work ethic in class, so we'll leave it at that. The Netherlands also win their independence from Spain in actually that should say 1581, forgive me, I inverted those numbers, 1581, the Spanish become, the other way around, the Dutch win their independence from the Spanish in 1581. I already talked about the Iroquois Alliance, I already talked about this. Okay, moving on, so Virginia. Sorry, the map looks a little bit funky, but I really wanted to show you this really cool older representation of the entire colony of Virginia. But we're really just going to focus on the early Virginia settlements, Jamestown, Colonial Williamsburg, and then we will talk about the extended Virginia and Bacon's Rebellion in a future video here. Okay, so Virginia was established because it was sponsored by a joint stock company called the Virginia Company. And the first crop, for lack of a better word, of settlers to the Virginia, by the Virginia Company to the Virginia colony, actually embarked in late 1606, but it did not arrive in the Chesapeake Bay region until the spring of 1607. Okay, and that's when Jamestown is established. Hooray! So looking back at the location of Jamestown, actually, it's just south of Williamsburg. We don't actually literally see it here. Okay, so you see Colonial Williamsburg here. Jamestown is just over there. Anyway, also this is cut off here. The colonists had similar rights to the Englishmen. So basically what that meant was that according to the charter of the Virginia Company, the the colonists were guaranteed the same rights as Englishmen, as if they stayed in England. Also, this means that this provision of similar rights actually was incorporated into the future colonist documents. Colonists also felt that even in the Americas, they had the same rights as Englishmen. Okay, so that's essentially what that means. So here we go. First off, it's important for us to realize that the Jamestown settlement, like we discussed in class already, was not stable by any means. See, I did this PowerPoint early in the morning and I'm catching all these typos, forgive me. It should say sort of an unstable relationship with the Powhatan Indians, not complete. So essentially what we have here is that the Powhatan Indians, on the one hand, sort of respected the Englishmen during the first winter, or actually really the first 2 years, the starving time, so to speak, which we will get into more detail with in a minute. Essentially what happened with the starving time is that the English settlers were desperate. And so they turned to the Powhatan Indians to get food, to get shelter. And so at first, the Powhatan Indians, and of course Powhatan himself, Chief Powhatan, Pocahontas's father, said that, or at least thought, that he had an alliance with the English, right? So essentially, it was confusing because after the English settlement started to become more successful, they started doing things like raiding Indian villages and stealing their food. And so this was really confusing to the Powhatans, who were a little bit more used to a relationship where peace was established first, and then it was very difficult to kind of violate that peace. So anyway, the first settlers in Jamestown were also very, almost exclusively men. Just a few men brought their wives, but that's it. So this, adventurers, gentlemen, and ne'er-do-wells, that means never do well, by the way. So essentially what this means is that you had a few different sort of typical settlers in Jamestown, people who just went for the heck of it, kind of young, unmarried men who had nothing to lose, the sort of rich aristocracy who planned on just capitalizing upon the gold that they at least imagined to be in Virginia, and ne'er-do-wells, or never-do-wells, which basically meant criminals, vagrants, people who didn't have a job and didn't have any prospects in England. The starving time, I think we might just talk about this and then pick up with a part 2 video. Okay, so the starving time, again, we discussed in class, but just a few more details that might be interesting to you. Well, first off, before the starving time even happened, in 1606, while the first voyage to the New World is happening, 40 people died. Okay, so that gets us going. Then in 1609, another ship from England actually lost its leaders and supplies in a shipwreck off the coast of Bermuda. Settlers, once they arrived in Jamestown, died by the dozens. The so-called gentlemen settlers actually refused to work because they believed that they should live like the aristocracy lived in England. So even though people everywhere around them just were dropping dead, they, at least initially, just kind of sat around and watched it happen. There was plentiful food in Jamestown. So that's sort of maybe a misconception. Basically, there was game throughout the forests. Streams were stocked with fish. But many of the English settlers, at least at first, just either did not know how to hunt or even gather in the forests, or they just refused to. It was sort of a combination of both. A lot of settlers actually spent much more time looking for gold and did not hunt or farm. Okay, there is actually a very brief attempt at an alliance between the Powhatans and the English, and that takes place actually with the marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe, which we'll talk about in the part 2 video more. When Pocahontas dies, by the way, that it sort of signals the initial decline of the Powhatan Confederacy. I'm going to stop this right here. We're going to pick up actually with a little bit more detail on the starving time.